welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Chris Graham.
And I'm Crystal Graham.
Special show this week, Crystal. It's the 15-year anniversary this week of the September 11, 2001 attacks, and we brought with us a couple of guests to help us kind of tell two stories about 9/11. Our first guest will be Bob Johnson, who is a chaplain and was a police chaplain who served at Ground Zero in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 for weeks thereafter, working with first responders and recovery folks and such. And we'll kind of talk some raw emotion. And then second segment, we have Daryl Byler from the Center for Justice and Peace Building at EMU, who was also, actually, he was in D.C. On the 9/11 day and was near the White House and can give us that perspective, but then also traveled the Middle East for a few years, lived in the Middle East, and can kind of give us a perspective from that as well.
We were talking before the show started a little bit about how there's certain things that have happened in our lifetime that we all remember, you know, from Kennedy being shot, Reagan being shot, and September 11th is kind of another one of those things that we all remember where we were, you know, when we first started getting news that the first tower was hit.
And you know, when we were driving up here today, Crystal, we were thinking about how much the world has changed since then, and among the things, there was no social media to share things then. You know, we take for granted Facebook and Twitter and things of that nature. And this news still happens sort of in the old era, if you want to say. There was an internet, there were internet news sources, but they weren't what they are now. Mm-hmm. This was still largely a TV event. I remember gathering around a big screen TV in the old grand piano, as they called it back then, in downtown Waynesboro, with a large group of people who were watching the reports from, I think, CNN even probably that day. And so, yeah, it was one of those things that we all experienced, and it was something that impacted us no matter where you were in the United States and the world. It was something that touched us all, you know, so there were certainly raw emotions that I think we still kind of feel whenever these anniversaries come up.
Well, so 15 years, and I just remember being in a newsroom with no television when the news broke, and we were scrambling to get a TV into our newsroom and just pick up, you know, the broadcast signal because we didn't have cable or anything like that. And you were filling me in, and I was trying to read the internet, and there was, you know, just so much information out there. And I also remember, you know, my grandfather actually passed away shortly after September 11th, and I remember that their planes weren't flying yet.
That's right.
And so we actually had to drive to Minnesota. So, you know, and I remember thinking even if planes were flying, I didn't want to get on one.
I remember just thinking about how weird it was after that week or 10 days or so when the planes weren't in the air, and then seeing the first plane flying overhead afterwards and thinking, wow, that's, you know, this kind of breaks the silence a little bit to see that. So yeah, it was a time that touched us all and changed the world for what it has done. So let's bring in our guest here, Bob Johnson. Bob, welcome to our show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And talk a little bit about first. Now you've been traveling a lot. You were living in Waynesboro at the time of the 9/11 attacks. You were on the road for a while. Now you're back in the area. But in September of 2001, you were I know you were a police chaplain at the time too, right?
Yes, I was a police chaplain. I was also working at the time at one of the area churches as a pastor, and happened to be at my favorite restaurant, you know, over in Verona. And when it happened, and I knew right away something. That was my hometown. I was born in Long Island. Went through New York. I drove buses there. I knew I had to do something, and as a chaplain, I knew we would probably be called. And so I contacted our ICPC, which is International Conference of Police Chaplains, and they said, yes, stand by, we're going to get our chaplains there. And we got a call from Port Authority to do that.
I first met you, I think, when you were writing a book about your experiences going to Ground Zero and just, you know, how you felt as a spiritual leader in the community and how you know, you helped pastor the people that were there, both workers as well as survivors that you happened upon there. But I thought maybe you could share your experiences when you first got to Ground Zero, what it was just like seeing the devastation around you.
Well, to be honest with you, I really didn't have a picture in my mind. I knew we had seen it on TV, but I didn't really know what it was going to be like in person. I was assigned to Pier 94, which was the first step we had to do, which was where they had a lot of the agencies there helping folks. And I realized right away that my job as a chaplain wasn't to preach. It wasn't there to give a sermon. It was there to have a good 2 ears so that I could listen to those folks, because I immediately ran into two people who had lost loved ones, brother and sister, and they talked and they wanted to talk and get it out, and I found out right away what my job was going to be, and it was just to be there, be a presence, and to be a good listener, and it just the impact of. And then when I got to see 9/11, it just no other words to use, but it just blew me away. I had no idea the smells and the sights and the fires and the smoke and the people working and the firemen down there and the steel workers and the cranes, and I had absolutely no idea it was going to be like that.
And it was even though the devastation was what it was the sense of the people working, I mean, was it still in their mind a recovery effort? They were still trying to do what they could do to find someone maybe that they could, just pull out and say we did something positive here?
I really believe that they kept doing that, because the amazing thing that I saw was these cranes were tremendously big, okay? And what they were doing, instead of trying to just dig down into the dirt, they would kind of scrape the dirt, and hopefully they could find somebody. Because they did find some folks, I believe, after right away, under the rubble. But at that point, though, probably they weren't going to find anybody, most likely. But they never gave up hope.
What I remember too, and maybe you can share one of the scenes memories is, but I remember the sad pictures of people who would put up the flyers on telephone poles or on bulletin boards. This person's missing. If you've seen them, please let me know.
Right.
I mean, seeing that on TV got my emotions up. I can only imagine what it was like being there.
One of the places we could go after we were tired and we needed to get a respite time, we went to St. Paul's Church. That's that little church that was next to the towers that didn't get damaged. They used that for a respite area. And fire, police, people who are working down in the ground zero would go there. And all along that fence, if there's pictures and pictures of the folks that were missing, flowers and banners, and in the church, all around that church were just banners and names from all over the world that was sent there, so that to offer condolences, to offer support, to say we're praying for you. It was amazing, and it was a good place to go into. You could just sit down. It was quiet. They had food. They had massages going on. If you wanted to sit in a chair, you could sleep. It was just a great place to have available to you. But yeah, they were everywhere. People really had a real sense of wanting to try to hope that somebody could be found.
We want to remind viewers, of course, that you can join the conversation with us. If you have any questions for our guests this evening, feel free to join us on WVPT's Facebook page and ask your questions or weigh in with where you were on September 11th and some of your memories. Bob, you had a lot of experiences coming back from them. Your book focused primarily on the spiritual role, on where was God through all of this. I thought maybe you could talk about, what you saw at Ground Zero that kind of renewed your faith.
Well, a lot of people did ask that question. Crystal, they said, where was God in all this? Because as you have this chaplain hat on, you represent a God. And so I said, well, I think I've seen God. And the places that I did see God were in the folks themselves. It's not that I saw visually a God sitting there. I saw people working and digging and helping one another. And the great thing about that time was you heard, the unity word that comes up to me in my mind and says, it didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter what gender you were, what color you were, or race, anything. We were there to help and to work together. And that's what I saw there. And I don't see that now 15 years later. I see it's missing. It's deteriorating. We're not doing that anymore. And I just feel very badly as a pastor and as a chaplain. It's not rocket science. I think we can get back to where we were if we just stop hating and start to love one another like that happened. And the prayers that went out, and it didn't matter what faith you were praying. And so I really wish that we could get back to that. And I think we can if we just try hard.
So all these years later, just a couple of months ago,
Right.
a group of chaplains got together back in July, I believe.
Right.
What was that like? Maybe it may have been the first time you'd seen some of those people since 9/11, and so maybe that kind of triggered some memories too and some emotions too. But talk about that gathering and maybe what the sense was there.
Well, we had planned on doing a 15-year anniversary and trying to get all the chaplains who had served there. We had 134 chaplains that served. one of the chaplains showed up and who had the following or the past year said he probably wouldn't be there. He had gotten sick from 9/11. He had received cancer. He had lung problems, and we had a prayer with him at the 2015, and he shows up at 2016 feeling better, and so he was able to come. And that emotion, just to see him come together and us getting around each other and praying for each other and holding each other and crying for each other, I mean, it still invokes tremendous emotions within all of us. But I know, just having been there, I'm not afraid to cry, and I guess I do a lot of that sometimes when I think about the things that happened. But in a positive way, I wish that we could get back to that wonderful time when we could care and help each other. I don't want to see things happen, but I certainly hope that we can just join together and start working together again and forgetting about all this other stuff that's going on.
Yeah, why does it always take something negative to make
I
us
don't know.
To get together like that? Unfortunately, it can do that. So that is unfortunate. But it seems like there was some hope there from that with you guys getting back together.
It was such a great time to be able to talk to one another and share with one another. And with those folks who didn't get to go, they just gathered around each other. Yes, there's still hope out here. The experience of the gentleman that was in the tower when the plane hit he did our speaking for us, and to hear him talk how his life was spared, and his boss and the others who went a different direction in the tower, they were killed. He went down the stairs, they went down the elevator, and they didn't make it. Right. And to hear his thankfulness and being thankful for the fact that he made the right decision to go down the stairs, and it's just really still a very emotional event. But for me, I just want to see us stop fighting among each other and stop hating each other. It's just not the good thing.
Well, Bob, I want to thank you for your time, sharing your perspective, both from the days right after 9/11 in 2001, and also the more current event too. Our next guest coming up after the break, Crystal, we'll have Daryl Byler from the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University, and we'll talk more about the emotions of 9/11 and also how the world's changed since then.
Which is a very different perspective than we got from Bob. Bob, we appreciate you joining us.
The World Trade Center, Tower number 1 is on fire. Send every available ambulance, everything you got to the World Trade Center now. You have a second plane into the other tower of the Trade Center, major fire. A major collapse in the tower. The command center out here, everybody has, it was a major collapse. I'm in my rig right now.
So we just finished talking about the raw emotion of 9/11 15 years ago this week. And now we'll shift gears a bit, Crystal, and we'll talk, I guess it's still a little bit of raw emotion. Our next guest, Daryl Byler, the Executive Director of the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University. Daryl, you were on Capitol Hill on 9/11 as a congressional aide. Maybe first talk to us about, what that day was like being on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I was actually working on Capitol Hill in a public policy office, but I was over by the White House attending a meeting. Dennis Ross, a White House envoy on the Middle East, was doing a lecture on what had gone wrong with the Middle East peace process. And just as he finished, we got word of the attacks on the Twin Towers and at the Pentagon, and we were asked to leave. And we walked out on the street, and you could see the smoke billowing up in the air from the Pentagon. It was a surreal experience. People were all trying to get home. Folks were talking. Some were saying there's more planes coming in. Others were saying this is the end of the world. So it was kind of an interesting time. And in fact, there actually were no more planes, but that was the feeling. And folks were just winding their way home and trying to figure out what's next.
I'm sorry, Crystal, but did you have any sense, I mean, of course, now looking 15 years back, as you're processing all what you're seeing there, I mean, the world we're in now, could you have foreseen anything in terms of the changes that the world would undergo?
I actually wrote a piece that evening and published the next day that kind of envisioned what might happen, and unfortunately, the U.S. response ended up being very similar to what I imagined.
You talk a little bit about the U.S. response. You were in the Middle East for a number of years after September 11th. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you witnessed and how people in Iraq and that kind of thing dealt with the U.S. forces being there.
Right. Yeah, my wife and I spent 6 years in the Middle East subsequent to the 9/11 attacks. I mean, the interesting thing is that many Middle Easterners have a deep admiration for the U.S. They like so many things about this country, but they are frustrated about what they see as some policies of our government that they feel are inconsistent. And so there's frustration about the fact that we talk a lot about human rights, but we have unwittingly propped up some regimes in the Middle East that had serious human rights abuses. Or they see kind of a duplicitous approach in terms of how we responded to Iraq's occupation of Kuwait and how we respond to Israel's occupation of the West Bank. And so they see some of those inconsistencies and they find that frustrating from this country that is supposed to be a beacon of human rights and democracy. But yeah, there were huge changes in Iraq. We traveled into Iraq many times during those 6 years. Millions of people uprooted as a result of the war. In the Christian community, 2/3 of the Christians in Iraq have left since the 2003 war in Iraq. And so there's still chaos and turmoil, and it's hard for people to start to rebuild their lives.
You were there beginning in 2007 through 2013.
Right.
So your time traveling through the Middle East, living there, was in the midst of, I guess the immediate aftermath. 2003, the war starts in Iraq. 2001, the action starts in Afghanistan. And so 2007, there's still, I guess, some optimism that things are going in the right direction. But as that time goes on, there's less probably of that. 2011, Arab Spring.
Right.
Talk about the emotions of that. I mean, from the perspective of living there.
Yeah, no, at first the emotion was real excitement. I mean, things were changing dramatically, and people who had lived under fairly oppressive governments were finding their voice. They were out on the streets. They had decided not to be afraid anymore. And there was real hope that things were going to change. But within a year, it became clear that the aftermath of the Arab Spring was not going to be as positive as hoped for.
And so that's and everything that's happened since then, from the standpoint of the turmoil in Libya, the turmoil in Syria, continued unrest, if we want to say, certainly in Iraq and Afghanistan, those situations not resolved. This is all the spring from 2001, our response to 2001. Sure. Your perspective of having lived there and being a person who delves in policy and did before this, what can we do to right the ship, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that was very interesting to me being on Capitol Hill right after 9/11 is that it didn't seem like there was any space to ask the question why this happened. It was viewed as being not really politically sensitive to ask that kind of a question. But I think in retrospect we would have done well to try to figure out a little more what was motivating Osama bin Laden behind these attacks. The CIA had actually had an analyst following his speeches for years, and there were a few things that he kept highlighting over and over. It was the U.S. Military on Muslim lands. It was the U.S. Support for Israel. It was the U.S. pressure on Arab oil producers to keep prices low so that we could get oil, and he saw that as robbing resources that should have been for the benefit of the Muslim communities. So there was things that he was talking about. They weren't all crazy ideas. And I think if we had listened a little more carefully and paid a little more attention to those, it would have been helpful. Our response ended up playing very much into the narrative of the more extreme elements of Islam, and that is that the U.S. is out to get them and to destroy the Islamic faith. And so when we start large military actions in Afghanistan and in Iraq, it feeds very much right into that narrative.
How do you feel about the state of the Middle East now versus pre-11 as far as the unrest and the people there and just the day-to-day life of people?
I mean, I think most Middle Easterners would say that things are much more unstable now. And it's not just a result of Afghanistan and Iraq, but there was something that happened in the Iraq experience that unleashed some real chaos and allowed groups like ISIS to come up because there was no good governance in place. And so, yeah, I think most would say it is very chaotic. They're uncertain about what the future holds for them.
At the Center for Justice and Peace Building, I'm sure this is something that comes up as a lesson. I mean, and break it down in so many different ways. One thing that interests me is, and we talked about this in our first segment with our first guest, there was a time right after 9/11 where our country was more unified than maybe ever before. And maybe we gave that up because we immediately turned to war as the response instead of building. What can we do? And our country, of course, is still divided, maybe more divided than ever from a political standpoint. We see that with the current election cycle and the last few election cycles. From the perspective now academically, what can we do to maybe capture as much of that spirit of unity that we had for those few days after 9/11?
Right. Well, I think the main takeaway that I had from living in the Middle East for 6 years was I wanted to come back and communicate the importance of the U.S. being a better global neighbor. I think folks really in this country need to understand that there is still goodwill for the United States in the Middle East, but we need to be more consistent in our upholding of human rights. We need to do a little more positive job of modeling what democracy really looks like. We haven't, when you're living in the Middle East and the U.S. is promoting democracy abroad, we're not practicing it real well at home right now. There's so much polarization. So modeling that, I think putting more of our national treasure into diplomacy and development, both domestically and internationally, would help to build positive relationships. We have spent more than $1.7 trillion in executing this war on terrorism, and we have painfully little positive to show for that.
Before we went on the air, you said you had grown up in Harrisonburg, moved away for about 40 years. You've been back for about 3 years in your role with EMU. I'm just curious what exactly your role is at EMU. I mean, I understand you're the director of the Center for Justice and Peace Building, but what does that exactly mean? Like, what is your role?
Well, so the Center for Justice and Peace Building is about a 20-year-old program, and we attract students from around the world who are interested in developing tools and analysis that help them to work at peace building in nonviolent ways in their context. And so we get some wonderful students from the Middle East, from Africa, from Europe, from all over the world. And they come to our center and spend 2 years together. And one of the first things they learn is what it means to get along with someone who has a different worldview than you. And that's something that all of us need to learn, that we all bring different perspectives, all bring different gifts to the table. And we had an Iraqi student who I spoke with last year, and she said her main takeaway from being at our center was that I can be in a community of people who have very different views than my own and can learn how to care for them and they for me. And she said, that gives me hope that my country can one day be rebuilt.
We've been very fortunate with our day jobs at Augusta Free Press to be able to share some of the stories of both students who are there currently, but then your alums who are spread out all over the world. Talk about that if you could. Not only do they come here and learn and be able to interact with other people, but then they go back out to their home countries and have impacts there.
Absolutely, and that's an exciting thing. We now have about 550 alumni, and they are scattered in 60 countries, and we're trying to help them better connect with each other, support their efforts. We get projects. We have one going on in Iraq right now where we can use alumni to help do peace building projects. It's very exciting to have people that are right on the ground, right in the middle of these conflict zones, and be able to practice what they learned at our center.
And of course, it's so important. I guess kind of wrapping our show up here now, Crystal. In this day and age of the post 9/11 era, 15 years now past 9/11, what the folks at EMU are doing there at the Center for Justice and Peace Building is so important to develop that sense of togetherness that that's not always in the forefront, I guess, especially in a political context these days.
Political context and social media and things of that nature have really added to the landscape since September 11th. That wasn't really around for us to communicate now, but that I think that only adds to the divisiveness that we have and that kind of thing right now. But
it does seem like that. Yeah, we have all these tools at our disposal that can bring us together, and often we use them to tear us apart, and that's the unfortunate thing. So hopefully, as we wrap this retrospective, the 15-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, we can take some positive out of this, which is, the raw emotion and the togetherness that we felt in the immediate aftermath is something we can recapture, and we certainly hope to be able to do so. Well, we want to thank Daryl Byler and also our first guest, Bob Johnson, for sharing their perspectives with us and with you, the viewers, and remind you to join us on Facebook to kind of give your thoughts and opinions as well on this topic.
all right, thanks for joining us tonight for Viewpoints. We'll see you next week.
Like what you see, support WVPT. Go to WVPT.net and click on the Support Now button.